Hello, friends. Welcome and thank you for joining this integral circle called Hidden Opportunities in Disability and Inclusion. And I am very happy to be joined by my friend and colleague, Emily Goodson. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Ethan. Thanks
Hi.
for having me.
Yeah, we're going to share some research today and hopefully provoke a discussion a little bit if we can, either for the folks who have joined us live or also for the folks who may be watching us sometime in the future, virtually seeing the recording. So, Emily, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So, my name is Emily Goodson. I am an author and a speaker and a former HR leader. So, I built my career in startups, building HR departments. And as I was, uh, let me back up a minute. So I was like, got a little lost there. Sorry. Built my career building HR departments and tech startups, and really loved doing that, but found that I wanted to speak more to my personal experiences in my career. And what's most relevant here is I had a brain injury when I was 8 years old, and have had a physical disability ever since. And that was not really something that was a big part of my career up until recently. And so now, I've moved out of doing in-house HR, and just do writing and speaking about disability in the workforce and in the personal sphere as well. So thanks, Ethan, for having me and letting me chime in here.
Chime in is actually quite the understatement. I'll just burnish your resume a little bit vis-a-vis this conversation. We actually had not been in our annual research, the Integral Index, asking about disabilities. And at a during a conversation that you and I had over drinks a year ago or so, I said, "Hey, let's intercept the next index research that we do, which is a study of more than 2,000 people, in various job roles across the United States, by asking two questions. More or less, do you have a visible disability or do you have a disability that is not visible to others?" And so some of the data that we are going to discuss today comes from this research, which was inspired by our long friendship and that conversation. And anyway, so thank you, not just for joining, but for helping to awaken my understanding. And one of the reasons why this is important is not just because I'm friends with somebody who has a visible disability. That's not actually the only thing that is important to me here. I actually, right now, have a visible disability. It's temporary. I have had shoulder surgery. There's been points in my life when I've had a physical disability, and it is, just a stage in life that almost everybody will experience, that their abilities will not match the sort of designed to norms. And even if that's, simply the advancement of your age, your physical abilities change throughout life, and the world sort of greets that in different ways. And then on top of that, and that's something I care about, not just in the workplace, but for my friends. And obviously I'm having my own lived experience with that. But then non-visible disabilities. I have later in life been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, and I have treatment for that, and I have a number of people in my family who have ADHD and other cognitive differences, other neuroatypicalities. And again, the world is designed to norms, not necessarily designed to accommodate people who think differently, experience the world differently from these norms. In fact, no one precisely fits the norm and the average. And the work that we do at Integral is all orientated around, can we create employee experiences that are fulfilling for employees and do the best by their employers, like really create the conditions in which employees can do the best work of their life, have the most impact, and frankly, drive the business results, the revenue growth, the profitability, the better security, the better safety that we all want to have in our workplaces. So that's a little bit about my background. And then over to you. Do you want to get us kicked off here, Emily?
Yeah, sure thing. So as Ethan mentioned, it's not just the integral index. It's, there really is just a dearth of data around the experiences of people with disabilities in the workplace. And as someone who consults with a lot of companies on disability inclusion, I was super excited to have this data and for us to start having these conversations. And I can share that based on my own experiences as someone, who had a physical disability growing up and at a number of jobs. And then based on that experience, and then also based on my experience talking to a lot of people with disabilities in different, settings, corporate, startup, nonprofit. These are some of the common challenges that we anecdotally know people face. So disabled employees often feel they are undervalued. They often are not hired or are not looked at to be hired. Disabled employees are often under accommodated, which we're going to talk more about. Their needs aren't always met. They're also often under-recognized due to a lack of disclosure and subject to other myths and misconceptions. So anecdotally, based on my experience and the experiences of others, we know that these are all challenges that are going on in the workplace. And these are challenges we feel that if we addressed would lead to better productivity and better outcomes for everyone. So let's look at the data. So in the United States, this is a pretty common statistic. 25% of the population, commonly reported statistic, 25% of the population has a disability. So this is, if you look at research out of Disability In, if you look at research out of the CDC, there's a lot of agreement here. Now, when you go and look at workplaces, you do not see this 25% of the population mirrored. So within the integral index, we found that people self-reported that 13% of them have a disability, which is actually pretty high based on what I've seen from other sources. So Disability In, their research shows that about 4% of the people self-disclose having a disability. And other studies I've seen, it's somewhere around 6 to 7%. So when I saw the 13% in Integral's findings, that's actually a little bit higher than I expected. And we're going to talk more about the sort of fear and stigma around disclosure and talk a little bit more about why people may not be disclosing. But in general, when we think of numbers, a fourth of the population has a disability, whether that's apparent to you or not. And then we have this lower subset of people who choose to disclose. So why don't people disclose? So, when you look at the data, this circle over here represents everyone who responded to the integral index. And you can see the vast majority in purple did not disclose having a disability. If you look at the subset of people who did disclose, we're finding that 3% of them say they have a visible disability and 10% have a non-visible disability. Now, again, these numbers are higher than I see within organizations of people disclosing, but they're also lower than the population in the United States. And so let's talk a little bit about why people don't disclose at work. And this is a very nuanced topic because people should not feel forced to disclose. A lot of times this is their own personal medical information, and that's highly sensitive. But at the same time, as people who care about employee engagement and inclusion and workforce environments where people can thrive and be productive, we want people to speak up when they have needs. And that's, my concern quite a bit when I work in different workplaces is, do people feel safe to speak up about what they need? And a lot of times they don't. And a lot of times the reason behind that is the stigma that exists around disability. And unfortunately, people's past experiences around when I disclosed I didn't get promoted, or when I disclosed I didn't get hired, or when I disclosed people treated me differently, or it was spread around the office like gossip when it shouldn't have been.
Mm.
So that's, I mean, Ethan, I'll let you chime in a minute, but I think that's one of the biggest reasons from my experience as to why people don't disclose. Ethan, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I had a conversation with a friend of mine. I think it was kind of late last year. He's an executive at a major manufacturer, and it was a very painful conversation to have. He had a year prior, at the company's urging. I mean, there was a lot of kind of fanfare around mental health awareness, and he disclosed some pretty personal stuff, and they were really kind of actively soliciting executives to to share, in service of destigmatizing. And about a year later, he was part of a reduction in force and lost his job. And you know um, those two things may be unrelated, but in his mind, those were related. That he shared that he had this mental health issue, which was a disability. It presented as a ongoing disability. And then he felt like there was backlash for that that cost him his job. And whether or not that's true, I don't know. But that's the conclusion that he arrived at. And it's timely actually to mention that, because it is Mental Health Awareness Month. And for anybody who's interested in learning more about that, I can recommend that you go to NAMI, NAMI, that's NAMI.org. That's the National Association for Mental Illness, or the mentally ill, I think. At any rate, that is a painful story for me to hear, because the intention that the organization had was really, really powerful and positive, to say, hey, look, everyone can find a role here and add value here. And even if you have this disability, but then for it later to be interpreted as backlash, it's a painful story to hear. And unfortunately, that is part of the stigma.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I think unfortunately that's far too common. And I think there are lots of ways that organizations can combat stigma, and that doesn't have to be the only one. Um, but and it's certainly a reason why people don't disclose. And I think some of the myths that disabled people face, and these myths exist, and these are reasons that we don't want to always disclose. As a person with a physical disability, which is very visible and very apparent, when you meet me in person, it's actually not apparent over a Zoom conversation, which is a whole nother discussion we can have
Yeah, that's true.
at another day. But in the workplace, when I was in physical workplaces, it was very apparent that I had a disability. And so that presented a whole host of other sort of mental health and confidence issues. But the myths that everyone with a disability faces, and if they're trying to make that decision of whether or not to disclose, these things do run through their heads of, people may think of me as less capable. A lot of times our society thinks of disability as a weakness, um, or that supporting people with disabilities is expensive, which the research shows generally it's not. I mean, certainly if you have to put an elevator into a historic building or something like that, that's more pricey. But the majority of accommodations, such as, giving people more breaks, allowing remote work, noise canceling headphones, things like these, they are not that expensive. And
Yeah.
yet the myth persists that they are. So, all of these things run through the heads of people like myself when we're trying to figure out, do we disclose, do we speak up for what we need? Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's such a good point. And I think also, you have, if there is, I'm thinking back on the story that I just shared, if there is a consistent and ongoing support in these areas where people just know that's part of the fabric, people will be less likely to jump to these conclusions that, oh, I disclosed and then I had some repercussion. So
Mhm.
again, what I was saying about that story that I shared from my friend, I don't know that that's even the case, but that's the conclusion that he drew
Mhm.
because of this list of reasons here.
Right.
Surely by disclosing, I've created this problem for myself or for my employer. But if there's a real challenge against this notion that people with disabilities are less capable or that they're weak globally or that this is going to, like doing anything is going to be suddenly like destroying your bottom line. uh, you know, if that is messaged and supported through policy on an ongoing basis, people just won't arrive at that conclusion. And you don't have to get into this trap of trying to get everybody to disclose and then because you just normalize that, you know? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, speaking of busting these myths, let's take a look at some of the data from the index. One of the things that we found is that in many dimensions that we probe on in terms of employee experience, when we ask people about their mindset, when we ask people about their emotional state, when we ask people about their own relationship to their personal values and the company's values, the differences between the disabled population and the people who have not self-declared themselves in the study as having a disability are generally pretty marginal. So, for example, when we ask people if they feel that they're highly engaged in the organization, the disabled population there's only a 4 point difference there. So it's still roughly 2/3 of people said, whether disabled or not disabled. When we ask people, do you experience positive emotions at work? There's a statistically meaningless 1 point difference between the disabled and the non-disabled population. And then when we ask people whether their organization's values map to their own values, there's only a 3 point difference. It happens to be in the positive. It's more likely. It's not really statistically significant, but it is more likely, only marginally, that employees with a disability would say that they feel that their own personal values align with their organization's values. These are all drivers of business behaviors, like whether or not somebody would quit or recommend the company or follow various protocols. And then, you see these behaviors actually manifest. So again, when we ask people about some behaviors like staying with the organization in challenging times, going the extra mile for a colleague, defending the organization in a crisis, or sharing positive experiences about work, again, these behaviors that are exhibited are very close. So, you look at your colleague who's visibly disabled, or you interact with your colleague who's not visibly, or who's got a disability, but it's not a visible one. And chances are their behaviors at work that are supporting the company's strategy are just as strong as the rest of the population who doesn't have a disability.
Yes. And
Yeah, go ahead,
go
Emily.
ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah, please.
And I would argue that, going off of what Ethan was saying, I would argue that so we're seeing that the behaviors of people with disabilities are supporting the organization, right? I would argue that we can even maximize on that more. And because I think that people with disabilities in general feel so under supported at work. And the good news is they're already showing this supportive behavior, right? But in my mind, the question when I hear this is, how can we capitalize on that even more? Like, what would happen? Like, if people with disabilities didn't feel these myths, didn't feel these misconceptions, like how much more supportive and engaged would they be?
It's such a good point, especially
Yeah,
because in generally speaking, just to go back to that slide for a second, generally speaking, there's again, not statistically valid, but a marginal decrease across these supportive behaviors amongst the disabled population. And so your point about like, look, if we just did a bit more, if
right.
we just thought, and we're going to talk about some interventions and some attitudes and approaches, but we might be able to move the needle. And that's where the name of this integral circle came up. It's like the hidden opportunity, right, Emily?
Exactly. Yeah. And let's talk about, we pulled some data points where we feel like we can move the needle. And then we're going to talk about some more interventions and also get your feedback and anything that you're currently doing. But we found these statistics really interesting. So disabled employees feel less personal connection to their peers. And how do we know that? So when we're looking at disabled versus non-disabled people in terms of, do they feel there's a sense of camaraderie? We're seeing almost a 10% difference in that non-disabled people feel there's a greater sense of camaraderie. Um, Similarly, with the question, I consider the people I work with to be my friends, we're seeing a 13% drop of agreement on that question when it comes to people with disabilities. And that's very, I mean, it's very sad to me, to be honest. It's very hard to see these stats because I think people with disabilities already feel isolated, in their personal lives for many reasons. And then, to feel that isolation continue at work is very sad. And we also know, research out of Gallup tells us year after year that if you have someone you consider to be your friend at work, that leads to better productivity and better profitability. So from a purely business perspective, I think these two questions are ones that, sort of morally and ethically, like I want more disabled people to agree they feel a sense of camaraderie, but also from a business perspective, if we can make improvements here, that's going to lead to better business outcomes.
Such a good point. And it is really sobering to see that difference of, particularly that idea of friendship at work. So much of our social lives are entangled with our work lives. And if that is a deficit in a population, it's worth addressing, isn't it?
It is. And we have a few more sobering stats for you.
Yeah.
And the reason we're sharing these is because I know improvements can be made here, which we're going to talk about. Um, but the integral index asks some mindset questions. And one of those questions is, I am confident on a typical workday. Like that's my mindset confidence. And unfortunately, this is low across the board. With 35% of non-disabled people saying that confidence is a typical mindset for them at work. And then you see that 10% drop again. So, only 25% of disabled people feel confident at work. Then if we look at those who report feeling the Sunday scaries, as we go into the work week, again, we're seeing here that, 15% disabled people feel 15% more likely to feel those Sunday scaries. So again, as we go back to Ethan mentioned it's Mental Health Awareness Month, and statistically, people with disabilities do tend to have higher rates of mental health challenges. We're seeing this reflected in the data, right? Like people feel more anxious, they don't feel confident. And then on top of that, we do see a higher section of people with disabilities feel more likely, feel more concerned that AI is going to put their job at risk. And so, this population is vulnerable, and we know this. This may not be new to you, from understanding the myths and the misperceptions. This is a very at-risk population of employees, and I know it's one based on my own experience. People with disabilities are very high performers. They can contribute a lot to the workplace. And again, I just go back to this question of, if we find more ways to support them and to make them feel safe in the workplace, imagine how much better our, employee engagement can be, and our productivity, and all those good things.
So we promised that we would offer a couple ideas, and these are just baby steps, I think. So one is there is a recognition month. It's July, Disability Pride Month, and being able to at least acknowledge this population. I mean, you think about some of those you think about some of those dimensions that we talked about, like feeling a sense of belonging and camaraderie and friendship, being able to say like, okay, my organization recognizes that people with disabilities are here and contributing positively. And July is a great time to do it. If you haven't been doing it, great time to start. Baby step, but give it a start.
Yep. And we also should mention that tomorrow actually is Global Accessibility Awareness Day.
Right.
So you can mention that too.
Yeah. No, you don't have to wait. Yeah. So May 15th. For
That's
those
right.
of you watching this in the distant future.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, good clarification. Another step that we talk about a lot that Ethan, and I both talk about with different clients and employers is, your town hall or your monthly employee meetings, your space where you're getting everyone together. Is your content representative of all employees, and is it accessible to all employees? Do you have captions available? Do you have interpreters available if you need them? And then if you're meeting in person, is your venue accessible? So, again, these are questions that time and time again, unfortunately, people don't always proactively think through, and can go such a long way in helping everyone to feel included.
It reminds me of when I was at IBM years ago. I had responsibility for IBM's global intranet, and some of the content that we put on there, like our earnings call, for example, that was a big one. We put our earnings call because pretty much every IBMer, not everybody, but many IBMers were also shareholders. We had a stock plan and all this. And the earnings call, we were able to post the audio online. And but if you we were able to post the transcript of the earnings call, the quarterly earnings, and we were able to post a link to go play that. We didn't have an accommodation for people with low vision. And also, before we had the ability to post online, you had to click a button and request cassettes to be sent to you. Um, that was difficult. That was also 1999. And at this point, it is so easy to add some basic accessibility. And, to your point earlier, Emily, adding captions, being able to create versions of content that is more accessible to low vision employees and so on. This is no longer like a huge, costly production effort. It's like, 5 minutes with ChatGPT, right? Speaking of all that content, employee content, I mean, take a look at the photos on your intranet, on your employer website, like which employees get featured and called on stage at the employee meeting and so on. And just be honest with yourself. Are 25% of them representative of people with visible or hidden disabilities? Just be honest with yourself. And if the answer is no, you can do something about that. You can feature the great talent out there that has a disability.
And another step that we recommend is, if you haven't already, establish or support a community or an employee resource group for employees with disabilities. And, I think this can, and their allies, I would say, a lot of the
Yeah.
companies we work with, that's their approach for ERGs. And when I go into a lot of workplaces and speak with ERGs about my lived experience with physical disability. And a lot of times when I do that, I'm speaking to both employees with disabilities and parents groups, because I think one of
Mm.
the, populations we also forget about is parents who have children with disabilities. And, I can speak to this at length at another time, but, I had my brain injury when I was a child, and it really threw my parents for quite
Mm.
a loop, right? And you probably have people in that same circumstance in your workplace. And I think, it's really important to me when I go in and speak to people that that parents and caregivers also have access to my content, because they too need support, and
Yeah.
they too can be affected by these myths and misconceptions. So, that's another thing to think about, is like your content, your technology, your internal communities.
It's such a good point. And, one of the things I've noticed in the last few years is I'm seeing more of our clients and hearing about more companies that have ERGs specifically for the parents of children with autism. And I think there's just been a bit more awareness around autism in particular. There are more sort of accommodations available and so on. And for whatever reason, that one seems to be identified, but that is not the only situation where a caregiver of somebody with a disability is in your workforce and could use some help. And this is Lisa's last point that we'll make here, which is many organizations invest in various supports for people with who need some additional help, whether it's an employee, whether it's like like a employee service center, or it's access to counseling or what have you. And they make that investment, or they'll have a policy where they'll make an investment to say, like, you can take a certain kind of time off, or we will offer a particular kind of accommodation for you as a disabled employee or as a caregiver. But because they're not well publicized, it's basically money getting thrown away by the company. And that opportunity to unlock that talented person's incredible experience goes to waste. And so if we can do a really, really level best job of ensuring that everybody in the enterprise understands what benefits are available, what accommodations are available. Is it something as simple as you were saying earlier, as like noise canceling headphones, for, whatever, for an office where somebody with ADHD might have zero productivity without, and somebody, like if you throw those headphones on, suddenly they're, superpower, right? Could it be as simple as just making it well known? You can use things like the Disability Pride Month to, shine a little bit more spotlight on some of those accommodations. So we wanted to end with a couple questions. We have got this photo of these two fabulous hidden opportunity, talented people here on the page. I think, I just put it out there, you know, are we doing the best that we can to attract and then to keep the very best people that we have? Like there's such a talent pool here. Are we doing the best that we can? And what else can we do to promote a culture of belonging? And it's a fraught time to do that for sure. And still, it's not just a moral obligation, but there's a clear business benefit and a case to be made. I think we've made that case here, and hopefully these data points will allow you to do the same. And then in what ways can we use this whole opportunity of enabling those of us with disabilities in the workforce to avoid the reputational risk? You don't want to be that company that has somebody talking badly about them, as I shared in my story. I did not feel welcome there. I felt like disclosure was a risk. I felt like there was that organization did not support me. You don't want to be that company. It's a reputational risk. It's a legal risk. Emily, before we turn it over for discussion, any additional or closing thoughts from you?
Just to kind of double tap on what Ethan was saying about the data, as I worked, for 10 plus years in HR in-house, and I know how hard it is to get support and also financial backing for different initiatives around inclusion sometimes. So I'm super excited about this data. I was really excited when I first saw it, still excited about it, because I really do think it shows that there are so many opportunities here, where we can just better engage people with disabilities. And it also shows people with disabilities are supportive, they're loyal, they're helping organizations. And so why wouldn't we just want to, double down on that and get people even more engaged and supportive? So yeah, I would just echo that and add, if you have questions about the data and how to use it, like now is the time. Like we can open it up to your questions about, elaborating on any of our experiences or suggestions, but also talk more about the data if people are interested in that too.
Amazing. And for those of you who are watching this integral circle in the near or distant future, you can get in touch with me or with Emily at teamintegral.com. And then I also just put the QR code there. If you'd like to get the full report, you can download our full report. And we just kind of gave a sampling of some of the data that exists in there. There's more to be had. With that, how about if we open it up for any questions? Of which there may be none, which is fine.
Everyone may be an expert.
Yeah, yeah, we got a good crowd here. So I want to thank everybody for joining, and we'll follow up with a link so that everybody can get get the video. Emily, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. And I'll hang out for a few minutes in case anyone does have questions. Thank
Thank
you
you.
for having me.